For Houston, from Houston, this is the Jimmy Barrett Show on KPRC 950.
If your boss calls you up and says, hey, we're bringing everybody back in, we're fully open, thank you for coming in all this time, but from starting on this particular date, we need you to have been vaccinated, or you can't come in here to work. And if you can't come in here to work, then we might not need you anymore. I'm guessing there'll be a few employers that'll make those decisions. Joining us to talk about it is Quentin Brogdon, attorney at law, here to talk about the legalities. We know it's very, very difficult. We've talked about this before, Quentin. We know it's very difficult for the government to order you to do something like that, but it's perfectly within the rights of your private employer to do it, isn't it?
That's right, Jimmy. Good afternoon. If there was any doubt about it, the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the federal agency, about a week ago issued some clarifying guidelines that says, those guidelines say that a vaccination is not a prohibited medical exam under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And translating that into plain English, it simply means employers can require it, but that doesn't mean, for instance, the pre-screening questions that the employers might do. If the employers are doing those pre-screening questions themselves, then they're running afoul of the guidance. And if they're administering the vaccines themselves, probably running afoul of the guidance. So if you're going to make it mandatory, you want the pre-screening done by somebody else, and you want the employees going to their own doctors or to a pharmacy. And personally and legally, I think your best option, if you can, unless you're a nursing home or a hospital where maybe you really need to make it mandatory, but if you're any other kind of employer almost, you want to try and incentivize the employees to do it voluntarily. That's always the best thing for both the employers and the employees. Okay.
Now, let's take a look at the voluntary thing. What is the best way to approach it? Should you take a carrot-stick approach? In other words, we'd like you to volunteer to do this, and if you do, we're going to give you a $1,000 bonus.
That's right. I think monetary incentives, last time I checked, those usually work pretty well with employees. So a monetary incentive, and maybe, for instance, you don't have to wear as much PPE if you've been vaccinated as you do if you haven't. Even under these new EEOC guidelines, the employers are going to have to accommodate sincerely held religious beliefs and also accommodate, if they reasonably can, disabilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Somebody has some kind of condition, an immune disorder, for instance, where they're going to be particularly susceptible to bad effects from the vaccine. As an employer, if you can let that employee work at home and still get the job done, maybe you need to do that as an accommodation.
Okay. Is there any protection under HIPAA law? In other words, let's say your employer says, I'm not going to order you to get a vaccine, but I'm going to ask you if you've had the vaccine, and you say, yeah, I got the vaccine. There's no way they can look into your medical records to find out if you're telling the truth, correct?
That's right. They can't go digging in your medical records, that's clear, but they might be able to require some kind of proof you've had it. And so if you're going to mandate it and you're going to have it done off-site, probably you're going to want and need something from the pharmacy or the doctor saying, Jim Jones, you have gotten that vaccine for COVID. And so, the restrictions are been loosened up quite a bit because of this 100-year pandemic, and employers are being given quite a bit more latitude. And this interpretation by the EEOC clears the way probably for all employers to mandate a vaccine. But my advice to any employer who asks would be, unless there's a particularly risky environment, a nursing home or a healthcare environment, I would not mandate it. I think you're still subject to legal challenge. Just because you can do something legally does not mean you necessarily should.
Well, just because you can doesn't mean you should. There's no doubt about that. Here's the other thing I'm struck by, because I really have never thought in this whole thing, Quentin, I never really thought that we would be dealing with the government mandating something, because I don't believe it's within their power to do so. I don't think they have to, though. All you have to do, you're the President of the United States, you pick up the phone, You call United Airlines here in Houston and you say, listen, we've got a lot of money coming your way in this stimulus package. You're probably going to need help in another 3 or 4 months. We're prepared to help you again, but we need you to help us. And we want you to require all airline passengers to be vaccinated before you allow them to fly. And you get all the airlines to go along with that. And you start taking away freedoms from people, their ability to travel without having proof of vaccination. And before you know it, you got a lot of people who are standing in line to get a vaccination because they want to go on vacation.
That's right, Jimmy. And you hit the nail on the head there. So many things and requirements that we just pretty much take for granted. Speed limits nationally, or the limits for legal intoxication for drunk driving. The federal government doesn't say to a state, you have to mandate it at, 0.08 milliliters or, but what they say is, unless you do mandate it at this limit that we want, then we're not giving you all of this federal road money, for instance. So the federal government, through the power of the purse, if you will, can require things really without mandating them. And it goes through health insurance and, Obamacare. It was a tax thing. It wasn't a mandate per se that you buy health insurance, but it was a tax if you did not, a tax penalty. So lots of things are done that way, and this could end up, ultimately being one of those types of things in one form or fashion. No question.
I wonder, too, the government, like I said, is not likely to come out and say you must have a vaccine, but are there things that they can implement that they could restrict you in having? For example, let's say it's time to renew your passport, and they say, well, we can't renew your passport unless you've had the COVID vaccine. Is that something they could potentially do?
Certainly. The government, in its policing powers and its powers to, for public health and safety, can do quite a bit. It's not unlimited, but there was a case that's been often discussed in recent months, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, a United States Supreme Court case, believe it or not, from 1905, where the state of Massachusetts mandated smallpox vaccination, or if you didn't get one, you faced a $5 fine. I guess back when $5 was a real penalty. And the United States Supreme Court said essentially the rights of the individual may at times, under the pressure of great dangers, be restrained, by reasonable regulations for the safety of the general public. Now, there's been a lot of case law and a lot of statutes enacted, cases decided and statutes enacted since then, but that case, at least in the eyes of some, stands for the proposition that for the public safety, rights can be infringed on. And the question is to what degree, and it's a balancing test. How big is the danger versus how big is the infringement? And how big is the necessity, for public safety? And depending on who the judge is and who looks at it, what weight do you give to each of those factors? You could come out with a different subjective analysis.
I wonder, too, Quentin, that's the federal government, of course. What can state government do? For example, not that we would ever do this in Texas. I don't think we're the kind of state that would. But I could see in California, for example, somebody like a Gavin Newsom saying you cannot renew your California driver's license unless you've had the COVID vaccine. Can a state do something like that?
Well, if this Jacobson versus Massachusetts case is still good law, and it has not been overturned, but Justice Samuel Alito, for instance, in a speech a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago now, talked about the infringement of freedoms caused by COVID and how concerned he was about it. He called it a constitutional stress test, and he mentioned this Jacobson case in his speech to a group of lawyers and judges, and he implied at least that it may not be still good law or completely good law in light of all the things that have happened since. But that case allowed the state of Massachusetts to enact a mandatory smallpox vaccination requirement. So if that case is still good law, it would be some authority at least for the idea that California or whatever state could potentially do that for COVID.
That's amazing. Yeah, that is amazing. What's interesting to me, too, is that I think we looked at the vaccine coming, Quentin. I think we looked at that as potential freedom for us from all these restrictions and all these draconian measures. And the reality that the vaccine could become the most draconian measure of all.
That's right. Some people have a fear of vaccines, and again, it's a balancing test. When we sell aspirin, we allow the sale of aspirin in grocery stores and drugstores, and buy it in a Walmart, buy it in a 7-Eleven, and we know to a certainty some people will die every year from adverse side effects from aspirin. But we've decided as a society that the benefits of aspirin outweigh the risks. So we don't make you have a prescription. We allow, people to freely buy it and use it as they want. But some people every year die from, believe it or not, aspirin. And so a vaccine is that on a much grander scale. We know some people will die and have adverse side effects from the vaccine, but the presumption is many more lives will be saved.
Right. And for the record, I have no objection to taking the vaccine myself. I'm willing, if there's a side effect, I'm willing to take a risk on that. I think the benefit outweighs the risk based on what I know so far. Maybe I'll change my mind between now and the time it's offered to me. But I don't want the government telling me I have to take it. I want the ability to make that decision for myself.
Well, I think you speak for many in that, Jimmy.
Hopefully so. Maybe not in all states, but certainly in the great state of Texas. Amen, brother.
We've always been a freedom-loving, and we make our own rules and our own decisions kind of state, haven't we?
Darn right. Quentin, thank you so much. Quentin Brogdon joining us. Have a Merry Christmas. If I don't talk to you before then,
you
take
too.
care.
Stay safe. Merry Christmas.
You bet.
Bye-bye.
Legal expert Quentin Brogdon joining us here on AM 950 KPRC.